Oh, there we go. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just record, as I said, the presentation piece, and then so Ciara is going to run through some slides with us, and then Heather is going to do some case studies, and then we'll turn off the recording for a Q&A. So presentation case studies will be about 30 minutes or so, and then we should have loads of time for questions at the end. So you can either, to submit a question, either pop it in the chat, and myself and Jacinta will collect them, or you can pop your raise hand up afterwards and unmute yourself and ask your question that way. So either way, and just make sure I've gone through everything else we need. Yeah, we've put everyone on mute. So just leave yourself on mute, please, if you're not talking. And I think that's everything. Oh yeah, just on the recording, we will circulate it to all the attendees afterwards, as well as the slides. Ciara and Heather have kindly allowed us to share the slides, so we'll also circulate those afterwards. So Ciara, yeah, over to you. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Okay, I'm going to pop up my screen. Now, I hope everybody is on board with me there.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, perfect. So, right, we're going to talk about optimizing gut health. And I want to say that we all know that long COVID is a very complex condition with over 200 or more symptoms. So everybody is different. And then gut health is very similar in that everybody is different and they're going to have a different microbiome and a different underlying gut health. So this is not a one size fits all scenario from either end. Everybody is going to need different interventions for their gut, and for every recommendation that I could make, there's going to be exceptions left and right. There's going to be interventions that help some people, and there's going to be some that actually can make people worse, or they don't tolerate them, or whatever. So bear that in mind as we go through. This is more like a string of suggestions or a list of recommendations, and nobody would be able to make all of those changes. But it might be, you might find something within that you could, even taking small steps or big steps or whatever it might be, just to move your gut health in the right direction. And what I'm going to start with is to try and show you how the gut interacts with all of the systems that we know to be underlying the pathology of long COVID. So why it's important that we work on our gut health. It is not a silver bullet. So, optimizing your gut health is not going to cure your long COVID. But like I said, it might be able to just move things in the right direction. All trial and error, right? Like I said, everybody's going to react differently. So it's all very kind of slow and cautious. There's other issues to consider as well. So for one thing, I think we're probably all aware that complex medical conditions are a financial outlay, and certainly the functional medicine approach is no exception there. There's also practical considerations. So if you or whomever you're caring for is barely managing their activities of daily living, then making huge dietary changes or adopting a very strict or strenuous diet is probably going to be completely out of reach as well. So you have to bear in mind the practicalities of the changes you're making. But like I said, anything small can move you in the right direction and will likely be beneficial. So I'm going to start with this slide that's taken from a fantastic paper by patient-led research. So this is the kind of underlying systems that are involved in the pathology of long COVID. And I want to show you, there's bunches of papers out there that say pretty much the same thing, but I want to show you how these systems are related to your gut health. So if we take the first three panels anyway, we're looking at things like viral infection of the gut, including viral reactivation potentially, whether that's EBV or herpes virus or other things. And then we're looking at immune dysregulation from that. So in some people, it might be chronic overdrive of your immune system where you're getting ongoing inflammation. In other people, it might be a kind of immune exhaustion after the infection. And then in a whole other cohort of people, it could be an autoimmune issue where your immune system is getting signals that it's then confusing and attacking your own tissues instead. And these three panels are so closely related to your gut health because 70 to 80% of our immune system lives at your gut. So, I mean, the reason for that in nature is because it is a huge interface between what I like to think of is the inside and the outside. So all day long, we are putting in foreign bodies, food, drink, dirt, debris, all sorts, down into our digestive system. And the function of your digestive system is to take the good stuff, right, to absorb the nutrients that it needs from what you're putting in, but to protect us from all the dirt and the debris and the bacteria that are going in there as well. So that is why there are so many immune cells surrounding your gut. And to function correctly, what you need is a healthy microbiome and the relationship that we have with it, some great immune defenses and a nice protective mucus layer that protects us from, let's say, the outside. A robust and strong gut lining. So that's where your nutrients and the good stuff is coming through, but it is keeping all the bad stuff outside. And just underneath that, your immune system is basically waiting to notice if there's any damage or anything going awry with that system. Now, in SARS-CoV-2 infection, there are receptors that are like the doorway for the virus to get into your cells in your body. And the ACE2 receptor, which is the doorway how your virus gets into your nasal passages, and your mouth, and your respiratory tract. But the cells that line your digestive tract have loads and loads of that receptor on their lining. So even if you didn't have any gut symptoms from your acute COVID infection, you can guarantee that lots and lots of virus got into the gut lining. And in fact, it might be able to stay there for quite a long time. We know that long COVID is associated with there's a risk for long COVID in patients who have prior inflammation or damage to their gut lining as well. So what exactly happens once, the acute virus or even the persistent virus comes along? So this is the virus entering your gut environment. It can cause dysbiosis, which is a term for when your maybe unwanted types of bacteria increase in the microbiome and your beneficial bacteria decrease. So I've put in a couple of species names and things like that into the slides because people can look at these slides afterwards. I'm not going to go in too much to the specifics of it because whilst studies show that Fusobacterium nucleatum, for example, is increased in long COVID, that's an inflammatory bacterial strain, but you are not a statistic. So you do not have to have this exact bacterial pattern in order for your gut to be impacting your long COVID. So whilst those are the kind of proven patterns, everybody will probably have a different pattern of unwanted bacteria that are increased and beneficial bacteria that are probably decreased. It'll also result in decreased immune defenses at the gut. The beautiful mucus layer that protects these cells often gets damaged and eroded away. And then you can have things like damage to the lining and leaky gut, where there are basically like gaps in between the lining. And all of the damaged signals, the damaged particles, toxins that these bacteria are producing, things like histamine and pro-inflammatory signals can get through the lining of the digestive tract. And remember, your immune system is just sitting there waiting to get those signals. So those damaged signals can cause a chronic, inflammation. They can cause a whole host of dysregulation in your immune system. And they can also convince your immune system to then fight against itself as an autoimmune trigger. So this is basically what we're trying to reverse when it comes to optimizing your gut health. But just before we get to the kind of how-to section, I want to just briefly go back to just a couple of the other mechanisms behind long COVID. So for example, we know that microclotting or kind of unusual fibrin, tiny microclots, can be responsible for reduced blood flow in long COVID, which can cause a whole host of issues. Anything that reduces the oxygen going to our brain and our cells is going to reduce energy and function all whole host of ways. Now, if you were thinking coagulation, you wouldn't automatically think, well, gut health, right? You would probably be dealing with systemic enzymes, maybe anticoagulant therapy, healing up the endothelial layer. So that's a whole kind of separate piece. But the gut is related to how our blood clots, which frankly I thought was fascinating. So if you have so the bacteria in your gut sends its metabolic products, the things that it makes, and it can go across your gut lining. And your portal vein is the blood system that collects all your nutrients, collects everything from your digestive tract. So in long COVID, the unwanted or the unusual bacteria are producing different microbial products, and they're going down into the portal vein. And the next stop from the portal vein is the liver. And that is where your coagulation proteins are being made. So the products produced by your microbiome directly influence your coagulation proteins as well. And again, there's a study, this is a study in post-COVID patients that had coagulopathy. So they had some kind of blood clotting issue. And they showed that, some bacteria were more associated with, say, platelet abnormalities. Some bacteria were in patients with high D-dimers or fibrinogen and blood clotting issues. But at the end of the day, again, going back to kind of our original goal, is anything you can do to heal the gut might reduce these signals going to your liver, producing your coagulation proteins. And then the final one is the gut-brain axis. A lot of patients with long COVID will have neurological symptoms. And in fact, a lot of patients with long COVID do not have gut symptoms, and predominantly, brain and neurological symptoms. But a lot of the signals for neurological symptoms come from the gut. And that's not just even in long COVID. We know that about anxiety and depression and other psychiatric kind of conditions. So it could be inflammatory signals, it could be bacterial signals. It also works the other way around. So we know this from patients who've had traumatic brain injury, for example, or TBI. And in this study that I've cited here, this is actually in rodents, where they induced neuroinflammation and brain damage, and they reduced the oxygen going to the brain. And that actually caused gut damage. So it increased histamine, caused more gut inflammation. And in this study, they gave the rodents sodium cromolyn, which is a mast cell stabilizer, to reduce the histamine. It was an oral dose, so it went down into the gut, reducing the histamine in the gut, and that improved their neurological symptoms. So there's a whole cycle here that we basically want to interrupt and improve. Okay, so back to our, how to and what we're going to do about it. So these are kind of the aims. You want to decrease your unwanted bacteria and increase your beneficial bacteria pretty much at the same time. You want to improve your immune defenses and quieten down any damage or inflammation that's going on. And then we want to boost back up that protective mucus layer that's potentially been damaged and repair the leaky gut so that the barrier goes back up again. So those triggers to your immune system can't get through anymore. Now, in our clinic, we would do a lot of testing because it really helps to inform a protocol. Now, you this definitely has a financial outlay associated with it, and there's loads of different types of testing. So cheaper tests will definitely maybe just look at the microbiome component. So it will give you a list and quantities of all of the bacteria that can be found in a stool sample. And that is good, and it is useful information, but it is worth understanding that they don't look for other parts of your microbiome, like parasites, and especially things like yeasts and candida. And there's a risk there that those could bloom if you don't know that they're there in the first place and you use either antibiotics or an antimicrobial. So it's worth finding out a little bit more information. But for us, we would never really consider using a test that didn't look for the markers of leaky gut or inflammation or all of those markers of the gut health. Because if you have a lot of inflammation or if you have a lot of damage going on in your gut, we would probably treat that as a priority, certainly before using any kind of stronger supplements or stronger antimicrobials, because you could just be kind of adding damage on top of damage there. And Heather's going to go through a case later and maybe talk a little bit more about that. Let's say you can't do a test or you don't do a test for whatever reason. There's definitely lots of dietary changes that you can try to incorporate, even if you don't want to go down too much of the route of supplements. So there'll be less risk involved in trying dietary changes. Now, going back again to the practical issues, if you are unable to prepare your own food, if you're relying on a provider or a carer to bring you food, obviously there's only so much kind of demands you can make. So just bear in mind that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to make absolute swaps or 100% anything. Anything you can do to incorporate some of these benefits is definitely going to help. So we know from actually quite recent evidence that inflammatory oils, particularly things like processed seed oils and seed oils that have been cooked at high temperatures, are really inflammatory for the digestive tract. Now, saying avoiding processed foods to somebody with a fatigue disorder or cognitive dysfunction, that is a very big ask, because you need the convenience foods. I totally get that. But there are definitely healthier options. And you could try and avoid ones that have a lot of seed oils and things like that in them. And what you could do is potentially increase your omega-3 intake to balance that out, because that's a really anti-inflammatory fat. And what I'd say there is that tinned fish and vacuum packed fish like mackerel is your friend, because it doesn't require a shopping trip, because it's a store cupboard product. It'll stay fresh in your cupboard for a long time, and it's already cooked. So it doesn't require any preparation aside from opening the pack and adding it to a sandwich or a salad or whatever you would manage to do. Sugar on the whole is not a friend to your microbiome. A lot of people might be relying on sugar for a short boost of energy, but I think we probably all know that that's a bit of a fool's errand. In the end, it doesn't do you really any favors to have the peaks and the troughs. Some people will go the full length and reduce carbohydrates altogether. It might affect their POTS. There's often, or orthostatic intolerance, there's often blood sugar issues anyway in things like long COVID, particularly with characteristics of ME, where you've got insulin resistance and all of that kind of thing. So there's loads of reasons why you might be reducing sugar. But from a gut health perspective, it's definitely something to try for. And on the opposite side of that, you are trying to keep in as much fiber and color and diversity and variety as you can, because your microbiome definitely benefits from having a wide variety of carbohydrates, vegetables, fruits, herbs, spices, all of those things. So, for example, I know that some people will follow the keto diet for the metabolic effects in long COVID. And that's fine. That's kind of like a different reason why you might be incorporating it. But you should try and remember that reducing the variety in your diet and taking out all of the carbohydrates might have an effect on your fiber intake and therefore your beneficial bacteria. So if you can try and maintain, again, depending on your abilities, as much diversity in terms of fruits and vegetables, herbs, spices, color that you can, that's going to be a really big benefit. And then some people will take out gluten. There's studies that show that gluten has a direct impact in POTS. So a lot of people will trial it at some point. And again, trying to remember to keep in some whole grains like gluten-free oats or whole grain rice if you are going gluten-free, or if you're going completely grain-free, then things like buckwheat or quinoa, sweet potato, all of those kind of things. Just options to try and keep in. It's definitely worth mentioning here that most people might trial a low histamine diet at some point. Part of that is because histamine plays a huge role in the pathology of not only long COVID in terms of neuroinflammation, gut inflammation, but also actually in acute infections. So it's a huge trigger. And then, you know, while we don't understand long COVID altogether, it's that trigger that's gone awry and there's no recovery. So tackling histamine is probably important for everybody to at least consider. And the tests are, well, first of all, they're extremely inaccessible. So I don't know how many people here have ever had a test for tryptase or other histamine markers. Not run very often. You'd want to be getting to some kind of specialist level at that point. And you could definitely have histamine issues without having a positive test for full-blown MCAS or mast cell activation syndrome. And then the other thing is some people will have tried H1 and H2 antihistamines, and if they didn't respond to them, they think, oh, well, histamine's not an issue for me. But actually that doesn't rule it out either. So trying a low histamine diet is probably one of the best ways to find out if it's an issue for you. So histamine builds up in foods as it ages or as we've preserved them. And again, without overhauling your diet completely, one of the best ways you can try and reduce the histamine in your diet is to freeze your food when you cook it. And that can apply for if somebody else is cooking your food for you, if you're getting batch meals done for you by somebody else or getting delivered to the house, that you cook that, or that cooked food gets frozen into individual portions. I mean, if other people in the house are eating it, they're probably fine, let them off. But if you want to take your portions and pop them in the freezer as soon as possible and then defrost them only within hours of you eating them, that is going to be a real key to reducing the overall histamine amount in your food. Similarly, if you were to buy a packet of chicken fillets, right, and you stick it in your fridge and it might live there for 2 or 3 days before you turn it into a dinner, freeze those portions, freeze the meat or the fish or whatever it is on the day of purchase, and then defrost it on the day of cooking. So just reducing down the time that food is basically hanging around. In terms of fruits and vegetables, there's lots of different options, and some of them are easy enough, you know, avoiding spinach or swapping out your strawberries. I would definitely say that tomato is probably the hardest for most people because there's so many tomato-based sauces. So it is the trickiest. What I would say is that bear in mind that everybody is slightly different. So while there's this list of foods that you have to avoid, lots of people will say things to us like, I definitely can't eat bananas, that triggers, but I can eat a half an avocado and it's no problem. And if that is the case, fire ahead. You want to be trying to reintroduce foods and keep your variety and diversity as wide as possible, whilst kind of identifying which are the biggest triggers for you. Now, I also wanted to mention, again, just on the idea of before you get into spending money and buying supplements and things, there's other things that you can do for your gut health. And the circadian rhythm is really important to your gut and your microbiome. And there's studies that show that sleep disruption reduces your beneficial bacteria quite significantly, and stress can directly cause things like leaky gut and mast cell activation, so things that we don't want. However, I mean, if I had the solution to sleep disruption and stress, sure, we could all go home now. So I don't have the answers for this, but it is a factor in, I would say, all patients with long COVID, particularly in those who have the characteristics of ME/CFS, that the circadian rhythm is altered, it's shifted, and it's reduced. So again, not going to solve this problem completely, but anything you can do to try and keep your circadian rhythm as structured as possible. So we probably all know about things like getting outside into the light during the day, but if you're not able to get outside, or if you're too light sensitive to be using, light exposure, then any kind of pattern you can keep so that your body gets to know, well, this is daytime and that is nighttime. So things like complete darkness at nighttime, and your room temperature a little bit lower at night than it is in the day, even if you're staying in that bed all day, that there's some kind of noticeable difference between your day and your night. And one of the things you can do is have a really regular eating pattern. You can also, whatever activity you're doing during the day, whether it's just a bathroom trip or managing to brush your teeth, or if it's just meditation, for example, that you do those at the exact same time every day as well. In terms of meditation, yoga nidra is exceptional for reducing stress, and I think it's one of the best ones to do because obviously you can do it without moving at all. And there's loads of free apps online for that. The Insight Timer is fantastic. But I wanted to mention the Nerva app because it's clinically proven in terms of its role in gut health. So it's a meditation app, but it's specifically designed for gut health. Okay, so I'll mention the supplements. I know we're sharing the slides, so I wanted to put the information into the slides, but I'm not going to go through all of these. And this is definitely not an exhaustive list. There are any amount of supplements out there that you could try that have been studied, etc. Everything needs to go really low and really slow, because for every supplement, there are stories that have helped some people and there are stories that they have harmed people. So you do need to be very, very careful. And I've tried to put in, some dietary options in there as well. What I want to say about this is, if you get a test result, for example, that says that you are low in lactobacillus and Akkermansia, a bacterial strain, it is not going to be solved by going out and buying a tub of lactobacillus and a tub of Akkermansia, which incidentally is really expensive, and just popping those in there, because that's not the way probiotics work. So they don't go into your gut and then just like populate the niche that was missing them and just take over. What they do is they allow your microbiome to recover. They create an environment in which your beneficial bacteria can start to grow again. They might produce anti-inflammatory, what's called postbiotics as well while they're in there. But they definitely need to get into the environment to help. They can also actually act to crowd out unwanted bacteria. So that's another thing I think that people often think. They'll do a stool test, they'll find the one thing that's wrong, and they'll just take something and kill that, and that'll solve the problem. Oftentimes you don't even need to do that. Just restoring your own balance is sufficient. And in order to do that, a kind of holistic approach to the gut environment definitely works best. So taking prebiotics, which are like your fertilizer to get your beneficial bacteria to grow. And there's loads of food options there as well. A lot of the prebiotics come as powders. You can take teeny tiny amounts and work up really, really carefully. And then taking in your polyphenols as well. So that, again, food-wise, you can do that quite easily with loads of brightly colored foods, berries, green tea, pomegranate is fantastic, lots of different herbs and spices. In terms of the examples that are kind of listed there, bear in mind that they all have loads of different effects on the body as well. So food tends to be, the slightly safer option. And then these are just some of kind of our favorites. I suppose we found them to be the most efficacious in our clinical patients in terms of reducing inflammation, restoring leaky gut, reducing a microbial overgrowth. But these would all be used based on a test result. And what I'm going to do is hand over to Heather, because bringing us through a case study is probably going to be the best way to describe how we would use some of these supplements. So over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Ciara, and hi, everyone. I can't change the slides, so I'm going to have to rely on my Ciara to do that. So this is a case study of a lady who was 2 years in her second year of long COVID when she came to see us. And it's a good example of why testing for her was really beneficial, because the results that we see vary so massively from patient to patient, and having kind of a concrete base to work on was really helpful in this case for me and for the patient. And she was pretty really struggling when she initially came in with extreme fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, PEM, POTS. She had been diagnosed with POTS. She was housebound, and she was relying on her other half, her partner, and her kids and her extended family to help her. So she made it very clear right from the beginning that she would be able to do her best, but that might not be perfect, but that was going to have to work, because we all have limitations in what we can actually achieve and what's realistic for us. She had an awful lot of histamine issues. I think judging from the chat, Ciara, you probably didn't see it, but the chat while you were talking, there seems to be a few histamine issues going on there as well. So that's really distressing. And that was particularly for this patient at the end of the day, where the heart rate spikes, the heat dysregulation severely disrupted sleep, brain fog, and photosensitivity, sound sensitivity, really difficult to concentrate, really severe headaches. So that was massively disruptive for her. And this lady didn't have massive gut issues. She had some gut issues. She's had them for a long time. Actually, she had some mild autoimmune activity, psoriasis on her chest. She had a little bit of bloating and reflux. She thought she was gluten intolerant for a long time. And what had happened since COVID was that she'd just become so massively reactive to lots of different foods, rather than the much smaller list that she'd been previously reacting to. So with her, we did a couple of investigations to start with, but we started with a stool test. If you wouldn't mind clicking on to the next slide, Ciara. And there's lots of really good stool tests on the market. This is the GI Ecologics with a company called In Vivo. And Ciara mentioned at the beginning, the reason we love this test so much is because it includes not only the bacteria, but also this really important health information, which is the first page of the test. And from this, straight away, I could see that for this lady, her immune defenses were low secretory IgA, something that's very important in that mucous membrane, mucosal layer that Ciara was talking about. So her immune system was exhausted. Her marker of gut inflammation, it's called calprotectin, was present. In an ideal world, this calprotectin would be at 0. She was at 43, so not severely raised, but there was clear inflammation present, which for us is useful to know so we don't do anything too extreme. Particularly the lady I saw actually previous to this particular patient had much higher calprotectin, which meant for her, kid loves, very little I could do until I reduced her inflammation. So it helps us to understand where to focus, where our patient should get most bang for their buck. And in terms of digestion, this lady's pancreatic elastase was just in range, so we'd call that suboptimal. And elastase is an enzyme that helps with particularly protein, but with digestion. So if you're not making enough elastase, you're going to be struggling to digest your food, get the nutrients from it, but also it changes the environment that the bacteria operate in as well. So that was a really useful finding. We would use digestive enzymes there. And there was no blood in the stool, which was really good to know. But this lady did have zonulin present, which is a marker of intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut. That's in normal range, but anything above 10, and we are paying close attention to, we know that that barrier between the outside world and the inside world has got some leaks in it. Now, Ciara, would you mind that? Thank you very much. So this is a list of what we call commensal bacteria. So these are normally the good guys. They're symbiotic. Many of them are very helpful. However, they are helpful in the right balance at the right quantity. So for this lady, she was very keen on probiotics. She'd been taking probiotics for a long time. She actually had too much beneficial bacteria, and at high levels they can be problematic, very particularly for histamine. Akkermansia and lactobacillus can be pro-inflammatory if they're too high in relation to, for example, bifido. E. coli is a histamine producer that was high. So straight away we could see her levels. Her problem was not low beneficial bacteria, it was actually the opposite. If you wouldn't mind clicking on Ciara, please, thank you. And we were looking then next at her gram-negative bacteria. That's a family of usually unhelpful bacteria. They're pretty resistant and they produce endotoxins, so chemicals that can get into systemic circulation and start this cascade of inflammation. And there's a few that we're particularly looking for in terms of immune system, the Fusobacterium family and the Enterobacter family. And then in terms of histamine, Klebsiella, the two Klebsiellas that are listed are problematic, and Hafnia. So straight away I can see this lady has too many bacteria in this category as well. And the final category that we look at, gram-positive bacteria. And just like in the other two categories, significant overgrowth of these bacteria, which in particular, there's a couple that we're looking for in this list, the Enterococcus and the Rhuminococcus, that are very damaging to that mucosal, protective mucosal layer in our guts. So this was massively helpful for this patient. We knew she had tons of beneficial bacteria. She was not going to be benefiting from the very expensive probiotics she was taking. In fact, probably helpful for her to stop that. And she was a person where it would be useful, yes, to work on reducing inflammation, certainly, but our main focus for this patient was to reduce inflammation. And one of the ways that we were going to do that was by reducing all of her bacteria. If you wouldn't mind clicking on to the next slide. Thank you very much, Ciara. And there was a lot of, we knew already that there was a lot of histamine issues for this lady. There was a lot of histamine markers on her stool test that needed a little bit of action. So one of the main things that we did for this patient was to reduce her histamine intake in the diet. And a very low histamine, a strict very low histamine diet is very, very tricky to follow, but you will actually, in many cases, get a lot of benefit from doing 3 or 4 things. Like Ciara said, it's going to be very individual, but typically what we did with this patient, we took out the food that wasn't fresh. So she was really, really fastidious about making sure everything was frozen the minute it was cooked or the minute it came into the house, and defrosted almost pretty much before eating. And she took out the biggest histamine triggers for a lot of people, and for this patient as well. Tinned fish, which is a real shame because that's a great source of omega-3, which is anti-inflammatory, but tinned or smoked fish is a no-no for most people on a low histamine diet. We took out spinach and replaced it with kale, significantly reduced tomato, reduced avocado, swapped strawberries for other berries. So in terms of histamine, those were the manageable changes that this patient could make, and took out gluten because that was, she felt, an easier step for her than some of the other things, the other options that was on the table. And that was all in the caveat that, you know, she could only do what she could do. She was dependent on other people doing this for her. So maybe she wasn't going to get to the 5 portions of veg and 2 portions of fruit that I was looking for a day, but she was going to do her best. And because she wasn't able to, or she wasn't able to commit to doing as much maybe on the diet as she wanted, we were relying a little bit more on supplementation. So for the anti-inflammatory picture, using an omega-3 supplement instead of eating oily fish. And she'd actually done nutrient testing with us as well. So we knew she needed the omega-3, she needed vitamin D, she needed vitamin A, she needed a whole plethora of nutrients. So we were able to put those in multivitamins, make sure she was getting a little bit of anti-inflammatory support with some of those polyphenols that Ciara mentioned earlier, particularly boswellia, reishi, and curcumin. They were really helpful for her. Digestive enzymes, because we knew she had low digestive capacity, her pancreatic elastase was low. So that was a fairly important support for her. And then the biggie was actually what was going to help reduce the inflammation, support the gut function, was reducing that bacterial overgrowth. So we use a variety of natural antimicrobials, ranging from very gentle to much more potent. And we would always start gently. And I should also say that I've mentioned lots of different supplements here, but we always say you put them in one at a time. If you start with 5 supplements, you start them all today, you're not going to know what you react to. And low and slow is very definitely what works much better for all of our patients, but particularly our long COVID or our more reactive patients. And this lady was actually able to quite quickly tolerate a fairly strong antimicrobial that we use called Candexebo. It's a broad spectrum antimicrobial that contains herbs like allicin and oregano. She was able to build up quite quickly to a full dose of that. And because of the histamine issue, she also used sodium cromolyn, nasal sodium cromolyn. Now, it's difficult to know when you're using lots and lots of interventions what is actually making the difference. But I think, you know, most of our patients want to try multiple different avenues of support. So we can't take the full credit for this, but if you just click onto the next slide there, Ciara, we retested this lady's gut test. We repeated the same gut test 14 weeks after she had started on her gut protocol, and her bacteria were massively reduced. So her beneficial were kind of where they needed to be. Actually, in her, most of the unhelpful bacteria, particularly the histamine producers, had come right down. And interestingly, her zonulin, that's a marker of intestinal permeability, now 0, exactly what we wanted. Calprotectin, that marker of inflammation, had also come down to 0. Now, our patients are not just a series of test results for us. So the patient also felt much better. Now, she wasn't fixed, but one part of the puzzle had started to work for her. First of all, once we had put the antimicrobials in and her gut was doing a lot better, she was able to introduce lots of foods that she'd been avoiding, and she was not reacting to them. And the big thing for her was the lack of histamine reaction. So she was able to read for more than 5 minutes. She was able to listen to a podcast, watch television. She was able to move a little bit more. She didn't get those massive temperature spikes, and the tinnitus that she'd been suffering was hugely reduced. Now, she still had many other things to do, but this was a big part of her puzzle. And the tests were, this particular test was really useful here because her picture was so different to some of the other patients that we see. I hope that was helpful. I hope that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what can be done. I'm conscious that I've spoken a lot about supplements. I'm sorry, we did lots with food as well, and we gave meal plans, and even the basic histamine diet that Ciara put 5 or 6 slides back, I think might be a really good place to start for a lot of people. And that will make a difference for quite a number of people potentially.
That's great. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Ciara. It's a lot of information there. So we've a good few questions. I'm just going to get cracking on them because I'm kind of conscious of time. So are there any over-the-counter supplements to address histamine overproduction?
Things like quercetin, or I'm trying to think of, I suppose quercetin is probably, sorry, go on.
DAO.
Oh yeah, the DAO enzyme, which is we produce that naturally in our own gut to break down the histamine that we eat. And a lot of people can be low in DAO. I think you can test for it, but along with all of the other histamine tests, it's not very reliable. So people definitely just try that. And it would be fair to say, Heather, that you've no idea who's going to react well to it. Some people think it's the best thing ever. And then some people say did absolutely nothing. So it's one of those, buy a tub. If it doesn't work, don't buy a second tub.
Okay, so much.
Yeah, and I will say that people massively react differently. So there's a lot of people who don't react well, where the H2 antihistamines make no difference, but something like sodium cromolyn will make a big difference. So for this patient, she tried DAO, she tried quercetin, she tried a couple of others. They didn't make a difference. She felt this one did. So it's very individual.
Perfect. Would one of you be able to just pop in the spelling of that? I think it's Queurcetin. Is that the one we're talking about? Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, so what does famotidine do to the gut taken long term?
Yeah, long term, it's a bit like any of the acid reducers. So famotidine does two things. It reduces your histamine, but it also reduces your stomach acid. So it works on two separate pathways. So if you have reduced your stomach acid, in the short term, lots of people will find that helpful because actually it's kind of like a gut rest, like just reducing all the acid that's going into your gut. But your gut is designed to have acid in it. So once your stomach empties out into your small intestine and further on, it's supposed to be really acidic so that you digest and absorb your food and your bacteria like it that way. So when you reduce your acidity in the longer term, you are completely changing the environment of your gut, reducing your long-term absorption of loads of minerals, including zinc and calcium and iron and all of those. You keep getting deficiencies, but then also your bacterial environment is gonna change. So it can be really, really tricky because if that's the medication that's, you know, reducing your symptoms and you really, really need to stay on it, how can you try and keep your gut as healthy as possible during that time? So you can try and acidify your environment by doing things, again, depending on tolerance, apple cider vinegar, eating bitter greens, all of those help produce bile acid, which will also acidify your gut. And then just, you know, all of the things, monitoring your vegetable intake and your fiber intake to promote your beneficial bacteria as much as you can, and or taking a digestive enzyme so that you're actually breaking down your food.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the one of the case studies there, what was the stool test that gave the results? I think it was the second case study there.
It was just all the one case study, and it's called the GI Ecologics stool test.
Okay, brilliant.
It's
Thank
by
you.
a lab called In Vivo.
Brilliant. Can SIBO cause fatigue and POTS?
Yeah, I'm going to give that to Heather because we used to call her Heather Leeson. That was her nickname.
Oh, it can definitely contribute to fatigue. It's linked to iron deficiency and deficiency of other nutrients as well, because a lot of your nutrient absorption is happening in the small intestine. If you've got a bacterial overgrowth in your small intestine, which is what SIBO is, then it can definitely impact your energy levels. POTS, potentially. There's many different things to consider there. But SIBO is certainly unhelpful, that bacterial overgrowth. This patient most likely had SIBO as well. So the antimicrobial was going to help that as well.
Okay, brilliant. So what is the average cost of the tests that you run?
Your average stool test. So do you remember I mentioned that you can definitely get cheaper ones that will just look at the bacteria, and that, like the biome site, for example, in the UK is like about 150, like that kind of region, 100 to 200. And then the ones with all of the health markers, like there's Genova, there's In Vivo, there's Doctor's Data, they all have a version of it, and they are in the 400 plus bracket.
Okay, perfect. So I started to get psoriasis after COVID, so get red patches. It's not severe, but annoying. Somebody suggested I should go on a glucose-free diet. Thoughts?
Probably a gluten-free diet. So there's definitely a link between gluten and psoriasis. I mean, there's a link between gluten and a lot of autoimmune issues, like rheumatoid arthritis, like there's a whole bunch of them. So while we aren't like everybody should avoid gluten and gluten is the devil, it's worth a try, right? You're not going to, so long as you're able, practically speaking, to try a gluten-free diet, you're not going to become deficient in anything for sure if you do gluten-free diet for like a couple of months, so long as you're not solely relying on really heavily processed gluten-free food. If you just try and rely on naturally gluten-free foods like rice and oats and all of those kind of things, trying a gluten-free diet is definitely worth it. With something like psoriasis, it's a bit of a slow burner, so you might not see a difference in a month or two, but so long as you were kind of doing okay on your diet and you felt like you still had plenty of diversity, you could probably keep it going for months, you might see a bit of a difference.
Yeah,
Okay.
and just to add to that on the psoriasis, and anti-inflammatory nutrients like omega-3, making sure your vitamin D levels are okay. There's a couple of other kind of key things for psoriasis as well, where you're just dampening down the inflammation.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So there's a probiotic apparently called Your Gut Plus. Any experience of that or thoughts?
No, it was part of a study in the UK, like a whole study group. And did they have a probiotic and maybe like a polyphenol mix? Like it was kind of two products together or something like that. I remember it coming out at the time. I remember thinking it looked absolutely fine, and that group is a reputable, a good research group. It's not somebody just trying to make a quick buck. In fact, that's probably why we haven't heard about it that much, because they don't market it that much. So I would say in terms of probiotics, again, you don't have to take the thing you're missing necessarily, right? So people can take a variety of different lactobacilluses, and they won't just go in there and restore your lactobacillus. They'll do all sorts of different things. I think people that are highly, highly reactive would sometimes prefer to start on single strains. So I think I wrote down things like Lactobacillus rhamnosus or Reuteri or things like that. However, other people react really well to multi-strain because they're all kind of in there doing different things to your own microbiome. The one that we probably use the most, some people react to it, but we definitely use it the most, and it really helps reduce inflammation, is the VSL #3VSL3 formulation, the EU formulation, and not the American one. That's a whole other story. But that has about 8 different strains in it, and it's a powder. It's very strong. So if you were to start on it, you're talking about like a speck, and then 2 specks, and that's how you work up. And any probiotic could be used that way. You can open those capsules and throw it into any kind of cold food or drink. Start really, really slowly with them.
Okay, perfect. A few people have asked about where you're based and your wait time, whether you're seeing new patients. You guys are in Dublin and Rathgar, isn't that right? But I think you're doing sometimes online sessions.
We're mainly online actually now. So we are, for face-to-face, we are in Rathgar, but it's all predominantly online. So we've a lot of for overseas patients as well as Irish, and yeah, nobody has to move out of their home to see us.
And is there a
Yeah.
long wait list for?
It depends on January and February tend to be reasonably busy for for lots of reasons. But we have actually our website has an online booking tool, so you can actually see our availability online.
Okay, fantastic. Someone believes that dairy might be contributing to their seizures. So question is, why would I suddenly become completely dairy intolerant?
Dairy is contributing to their
Seizures.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, that's exactly the whole breakdown of the gut barrier is why we become intolerant of things. So the dairy particles are now getting through into her immune system potentially, and causing a reaction. It's one of the reasons why we don't necessarily use food intolerance testing. Those food intolerance tests you can get at any pharmacy or Boots or wherever, and they'll list like 300 different foods. And if you have a leaky gut, loads of those food antigens are going to get through your leaky gut and will show up positive on a food intolerance test.
Mm-hmm.
And then what people do is they take out all of those foods and they're left with very, very little, which their microbiome suffers. And then if they were to repeat the test again, they're just going to have become intolerant to a whole other bunch of foods, whatever foods they're now eating. So when that's the case, what we want to do, that's why we do stool testing, is repair the barrier first. And then, if this person was not intolerant to dairy before, it is possible that they will become tolerant to dairy again once they repair the barrier and it stops triggering their immune system.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So someone's asking about honey. Honey have a role in, I suppose, some of these dietary changes.
Heather, you're the big foodie there.
Well, honey is, I guess, sugar. So some people will find it more problematic than others. Sugar is not just the white stuff that we pop into our cups of tea or coffee. It's the sugar that comes in many different ways, including, natural sweeteners like honey or maple syrup.
Okay,
So
Do you,
stevia, yes, stevia. Some people would be fine with small amounts of honey. I can see some of the questions coming in. Stevia can work as well. There's a whole host, but you want less sugar ideally.
okay, and that includes honey. Okay. Do you get any patients who get acute neuropsychiatric side effects to some antihistamines? So I suppose I'm thinking of isn't there quite a famous one that can cause
Oh, oh my gosh, start with M.
yeah, it does, and it's completely gone out of my head.
Yeah.
It's used in asthma a lot, and
Yeah.
it's completely gone out of my head. Yeah, antihistamines for neuropsychiatric.
I mean, like honestly, when it comes to long COVID, it's almost like that anything can happen and will
Yeah.
happen, which is terrifying in some ways. But that there are a couple of people who have reacted quite poorly to antihistamines. You're absolutely right. There's that one. That one has a black box label in the US, and neither of us can remember the name of it right now. Oh my gosh, so that is going to drive me crazy.
Yeah, I know.
So that has a very specific black box label for, I think it's for suicide ideation and all sorts of other things. But I've definitely heard of people reacting really poorly to ketotifen as well. And I would say this is just anecdotal report, right? Anecdotally, I've heard less poor reports from sodium cromolyn, but I've definitely heard them. So it's risky. In terms of trying those things. And as professionals, we would say, talk to your doctor. Of course, talk to your doctor, talk to your pharmacist. They don't know how you're going to react either. Like, I mean, there's no playbook to say, well, if you've reacted to these 4 things, well, now you're definitely going to react to this one and you're not going to react to that one. It's
Yeah,
risky, and that's always
absolutely.
the
I
way.
think my own
Yeah.
experience of 12 years of post-acute viral illness, it's, the medications I've managed to tolerate have surprised me, and then other things you think will have you no problem. And again, I think that the side effects that people can get are just kind of, there's a limitless varieties and there of things that you just
Yeah.
never know with each individual. What is the implication of an elevated B6 in the context of gut health?
Yeah. In the context of gut health, so it depends on what kind of elevated B6 you're talking about. And most times, if you're just measuring like a serum B6, it's because you've over supplemented, right? That's the reason. So obviously you would and that can cause neuropathy, tingling and nerve sensation, burning, all of that kind of thing. So if that's the case, taking out the supplement usually works. I would say 90% of the time. There are definitely cases where very high cases of B6 supplementation have caused more permanent damage. But usually, and certainly all the supplement companies would tell you, as soon as you stop it, it'll go back to normal. Now, you can have high serum B6 if your B6 is not getting into your cells, and that's kind of a different scenario altogether. So that can happen when your liver is not producing enough of the enzyme called alkaline phosphatase that basically helps your B6 bridge into the inside of your cells. So you can have what's called a functional deficiency. So your body is running on very low B6, but you have apparently buckets of it floating around in your system. Now, my brain is going, how does that relate to gut health? I don't know.
Okay, no problem. Is there a list of histamine foods? I think the low histamine diet is pretty available online, isn't it?
It is, and there's a bunch of them. There's loads of them. But I mean, the one we kind of settled on is histamineintolerance.org. Is that it, Heather? Oh, you have it on the slide for sure.
And again, like most people will get the most benefit from like the top 3 or 4 things. And you will get maybe an extra 2% with and 2% and 2% with the other things. But if you can just hit the main 3 or 4 things, that'll make it, for if it's a histamine thing, that'll make a significant difference. And it's not forever. Then you challenge it. You let things calm down, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and then you start to reintroduce.
Perfect.
And especially if you're vegan, because a lot of the low histamine foods are like fresh in terms of the protein, fresh meat, fresh fish. But if you don't really eat those foods, you're probably going to have to keep in the pulses, which are in theory on the high histamine list, but in our experience would be lesser triggers for most people.
Okay, good to know. So I'm conscious of time. Are you guys okay to stay on for 5 minutes or so and just run through a few more, or do you need to?
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Okay. What about the TUDCA, to move the bile acid, or too much? TUDCA. Is this making sense to you? Because that
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and it has, kind of dual function in the fact it's actually a fascinating supplement in the fact that it helps your mitochondria potentially produce energy. Now, again, it helps some people, doesn't help others. But it is actually a really useful bile acid form. And there are all sorts of autoimmune liver conditions. And I've had, before I had to go off work, let's say, I actually had some long COVID patients that had autoimmune liver issues and damage to their liver as part of their long COVID picture. And one of the treatments for that is UDCA. So without the T, it's basically the same thing, but it's like the medic version. It's the drug version of TUDCA. And the medical approach was wait till it gets much worse before we deal with that, before we give you the medicine. So obviously they just started on the supplement version instead, because what's happening there is your bile ducts are becoming sludgy and thick, and that leads on to damage and infection and da, 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 da. So if you can keep your bile flowing, your liver is always going to be in much, much better health. And then your microbiome is going to be in much, much better health because of the acidity of the bile acids. And then it helps you absorb your fats. It regulates your cholesterol. I mean, it does a million different things. We had a wee discussion about should we introduce bile acids into this conversation, and we were like, it's too much information.
and all I will say though on the TUDCA and on bile acid support in general, slow is really, really, really important there. Very, very slow introduction of TUDCA or whatever supports you're putting in.
Okay. I have Crohn's and enteropathic arthritis prior to long COVID, POTS, thermoregulation, body jerking, and brain fog. Can this be improved with diet despite biologic medication?
Biologic medication, as in, can you work on your diet while you're on biological medication? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, all of our patients, or most of our patients, are on medicines of some description. So we would take that into account when recommending supplements, obviously, because you don't want anything to interact or anything like that. But the dietary end of things tends to be the best place to start. Absolutely. And you can augment your medical approach, right? So if you are on an anti-inflammatory for arthritis or whatever it might be, your biologics, putting in an anti-inflammatory diet is only going to make that work better. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. Can I take probiotics if I have SIBO?
Carefully.
Okay.
Yeah, we use actually a lot of the studies show that probiotics will help with 60% of SIBO, but it depends on the probiotic, it depends on the patient, and it depends what else they have going on. So if they've raging histamine problems and a microbiome like the case that I walked through, then probiotics will definitely not be helping them. So it depends, but
Okay.
it's safe. It's not contraindicated at all.
Okay, I'll pop back to it and run through a few more questions, but I had a quick question for you, which I know some people have been thinking. I suppose a lot of people don't know what to invest in because they're hearing, good health is important, and they might be looking at mental health and investing in psychology, or they might want to try acupuncture, whatever it might be. I suppose, would you have any tips for anybody as a starting point for maybe someone who doesn't have the budget to look at getting some of these tests done? What are some things people can do, if they're relying on only public healthcare and that kind of thing?
Well, that's kind of why we will always, except with very exceptional circumstances, will always do an initial consultation with somebody before they kind of pick and choose and cherry pick really expensive functional medicine testing, because you have the person who said, I'm going to throw my 500 euros into this gut test, and then you have a consultation with them and you think, oh God, we could have spent 200 quid on a different test and it would have been more beneficial. Because functional medicine, the way it's designed is, when we all learned it back in the day, was you have a problem and you identify the systems that are, jumping off the heat map, let's say, that are involved in this condition. And in something like complex, like long COVID, they're all involved. It's like what functional medicine was made for. So you have to prioritize. Well, like Heather said, the biggest bang for your buck, if you work on your adrenals and your, liver, that, because of your particular flavor of long COVID, that is going to give you your biggest bang for the buck. And as I hope we've been trying to portray today, there's always the ways to try and do it dietary wise. You know, obviously, if you're extremely restricted in what you eat, you might need to work on supplements as well. But we will always try and come up with the dietary fixes as well, because nobody also wants to stay on these supplements for 5 years, right? So you might decide to say, right, well, I will take a, I don't know, ginger supplement for these 3 months, and then I'm just going to start eating it because it costs 40 cents, and I'll get it into my diet and not have to buy any supplements.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick question: do you treat test children and / teenagers?
We do a lot of stool tests with kids and teenagers. We don't do so many more intrusive, for example, blood tests with those cohorts, but absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so there's no minimum age that you guys would be seeing, or okay?
Well, probably 2 would probably be
Not infants, yeah,
young.
absolutely.
Yeah,
okay, perfect.
Although people do come to it for advice on their infants, I suppose.
Yes,
but yeah.
yes, they do. Yeah.
Why do you think the doctors in Ireland ignore a positive SIBO results, like gastro specialists? That's probably a long question.
It's not being recorded, this part is fine.
Oh, actually, remind me to stop the recording there, because we actually did.